Yeah.
Or Scully.
Thank you, Mr Davison. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I should also add my thanks and congratulations to the honourable member for Glasgow East for securing this debate. I was delighted to support him on that, because this is something, as we've heard from my honourable friend from Angus, that is affecting constituents with members from both sides of the House, and it's important that we do stick together to represent people and to stand up for the most vulnerable in our society. Back in 2016, not long after I was elected, I was faced with a couple of closures in Cheam, in the small part of my constituency, which High Street has many different independent shops. It thrives on independent shops there. And first of all, Lloyd's came to the end of its lease, and I would just counsel the constituent from the honourable lady from Haywood and Middleton. I actually said to constituents that were upset about losing Lloyd's, why don't they go to HSBC up the road? Vote with their feet. Unfortunately, HSBC, just a few months later, decided to close as well. So you can be pulled from pillar to post. Constituents can, by continually having to then move, because they're chasing this exodus from our high streets, when banks really don't want to be that last bank on the high street. So all the focus is on them when they eventually respond to a changing market. Now, back then, I still have retained a good relationship with my local Santander branch in Sutton, which looks after the two that are now closing. But at the time, I remember a tweet just back in 19th of May 2016 to a constituent. I said, you know, I've had a chat to Santander. They are closing what was quite a small branch in North Cheam, but they were committed to their main Cheam branch. Fast forward only 3 years, unfortunately, it is now closing, and that is the last bank in Cheam that will have gone. At the time, there were residents, when Lloyd's and HSBC were closing, that set up petitions, and petitions only have so much value. They can yes, they can show the weight of opinion. Yes, they can show the fact that, you know, will you please reconsider it? But when it seems when a banking chain has made a corporate decision, a petition will be there. It's nice it generates heat. It doesn't generate a lot of light. So we do need to look at other ways. Can we encourage customers to move elsewhere? Can we work on the post office network? But we've heard from earlier speakers the restrictions on that. And are we putting an unfair burden on the post office network and the government for these decisions that are made by corporate organisations, basically? What's been interesting in this instance, in the Santander closure in Cheam, is that 3 councillors there, Elliot, Colburn, Holly Ramsey and Eric Allen, have actually taken a different tack. Metro Bank are actually looking at expanding their network, and they're looking at other areas. So they've actually made a direct approach to Metro Bank. Well, here's a space here. There are no banks. It's an independent, as I say, it's an area where there's a lot of independent shops. Metro Bank has a different tack to its approach in attracting customers, trying a little bit of a disruptor-style bank. Why don't you come in and consider Cheam as an option then? So, but what more can we do? We've talked about the fact that putting the pressure onto the post offices, and in the same way in Sutton, we have a situation when our Crown Post Office looks as though it's going to be moved to W.H. Smith there, which is going to cause angst and concern to a number of people there. But on the other hand, not far up in another village, in Belmont, to the south of my constituency, there's a post office that's just been opened up in a pet shop, at the back of a pet shop. And it's one of the best used post offices, and it won an award for one of the best new post offices in London from the network, second only to one on Oxford Street. So that's pretty impressive, that if it's there, if you put something in an imaginative place, it will get used. So what more can we do? Whether it is the banking hubs that were discussed, the return from the 70s, whether it is some sort of form of technology that you're moving from a corporate decision that banks are taking to a marketing decision, which actually can go totally a different way, because that's a bank, then if they can take a marketing decision to look at innovation, then you're moving their corporate social responsibility away from just a tick box exercise to put in their shareholder report to something that can actually add value to the high street, tackle the issues that my honourable friend from Angus was talking about loneliness, about making it a hub, about making it a community centre, by bringing in other businesses to work with them to have the bank at the centre of the high street. So that's got to be good for that bank. Glad to give way.
So the members have about hubs. What role does he think the government should play in this? Because we're already hearing about the closure of Crown post offices, which the government owns. We are the tax people. Surely that could be a point where the hub could be, because they're very well located, they're owned by us, and that our constituents need these services.
I thank the honourable gentleman for that intervention, and he makes an interesting point. The thing with Crown Post Offices, we talked about the fact that moving them into WH Smith branches across the country is going to be limiting their structure, and they do at the moment have some quite big buildings. And the one in Sutton is particularly well used already in the massive floor space that it's got. I'm not sure how it's going to cope as well in being restricted at the back of I think so. Yes, it might be in a retrospective move. There's a limit to how government can direct post offices, direct banks and things like that, but it must have significant influence in terms of looking at the impact of the high street and treat it in a holistic way with, as the government looks at the future of the high street in general. And I mean, we've talked about the access to bank standards. I mean, what was interesting, at least we now know that Santander have to go through the process of working through, we would hope they would want to do so anyway, mitigating the results and looking at the most vulnerable people. And who are those vulnerable people? I mean, you think about who uses bank branches these days. It tends to be older people who don't necessarily have access or not as good as using technology as others. It tends to be retailers, especially the independent retailers that I was talking about, that are still cash heavy, that need to actually bank their cash. I was just looking at my two branches that are closing. The alternatives in Cheam are 1.3 and 3.3 miles away. The ones in Worcester Park for the closure there is 1.8 and 3 miles away. So for a small business, having at the end of the day to cash in, if they haven't got a post office near enough, they've got some distance to go with what might be quite a lot of cash, which is not very secure. Gladly give away.
Very grateful for him giving away, and I have to say that I support the point that he's making about the distance for small businesses, and we've had exactly that issue in my constituency of Reading East with post office closure, and I believe it also can relate to bank closure. We've had in one village that's near to Reading Town Centre but is a separate entity, it's a mile away, so obviously quite considerable travelling time for a small business trying to bank cash. We've had 3 banks close and a post office close. In other locations near Reading University, we've lost other banks, we've lost further facilities in other areas as well. And I think he makes a very good point about the need to look holistically at the whole parade of shops, the need of vulnerable local, particularly older people, and also local small businesses. And I would urge him to perhaps raise with his colleagues in government the possibility of some sort of area-based approach where these different needs are taken into account as part of the banking or post office regulation.
I thank the honourable gentleman for that intervention, and I know in Reading, same as Sutton, the mileage differences are relatively small, but nonetheless congestion, extra traffic means that times are still quite significant travel times, and we can't compete with the 15 miles that we heard from my honourable friend that people have to go. But I'll just make the final point so that others can speak, that when banks have to, or still decided to close, we need to make sure that there is access to a cash point network around them, so that people that are still reliant on cash, although that is dying down a bit, still have access to cash point. Because I know, I've seen it when I was a local councillor in neighbouring constituency of Carshalton, when speaking to a baker that was badly affected when Barclays closed in Carshalton and the cash point closed there. Because it meant that essentially if you have the car park in that local village, which again is reliant on independent shops, people tended to turn left to go to the larger supermarkets rather than right where the smaller independent shops are, that people previously walked past the independent shops to get their cash and then come back and then would spend money in the bakers, spend money in those smaller shops on the way back to get their main shop and those kind of things. So it does have a detrimental effect, and we do need to look at that, as I say, in a holistic way to make sure that we can have a thriving albeit changing, high street. Thank you.
Jim Shannon.